Hello, I'm Dr. Jane McCartney. I'm a chartered psychologist working in the UK. And for years, I'd worked in criminal behaviour and I found it an absolutely fascinating subject. And in these videos, the psychology of crime, I wanted to look behind the scenes a little bit at some of the headlines. So some of the people that are the headline makers. And in this video, I wanted to look at the crimes of Fred and Rosemary West, who from the 60s through the 70s to the early 80s would kill seemingly dozens of people, from small children up to women in their 20s. Before I get into the video, if I could please ask you to like and subscribe. It helps the channel enormously, so thanks for that. So, Fred and Rosemary West. Ultimately, Rose West would be convicted of 10 murders on her own. She was given a whole life tariff, which means that she'll never get out of the prison system in the UK. Fred West, you may or may not have known, again, he was up for the murders of all these women, but he killed himself whilst on remand. He was meant to be on suicide watch, which was apparently every 15 minutes, and at some point he fashioned a ligature and he killed himself. He left a suicide note, which I'll come back to a little bit later on. So in the 60s, he would kill a number of people, including his first wife, a woman from Glasgow that had become a nanny for him, and Rose West, whilst he was serving a prison sentence for a petty crime, would actually kill his first child that he'd had with his first wife. And they did this individually. And the fascinating thing about the Wests was that they'd both killed independently of each other. Whether they knew that or not, I'm not entirely sure. But the fact is that they found that out about each other. And you had this kind of meeting of these perverse and these bizarre minds. It's so mercifully rare, but they managed to find each other and get together. And their crime spree would begin. Now, they would literally trawl the streets of Gloucester looking for people at bus stops or hitchhikers. And it was said by the one person, and this was an early victim of theirs who got picked up by them, they would drive up alongside you. You know, you're at a cold and rainy bus stop and this car pulls up and says, oh, where are you going? Do you want a lift? And you look inside and it's a guy and it's a woman and you think, oh, I can just jump in, it'll be fine. Very reminiscent of Myra Hindley and Ian Brady, because that was their same MO. And as people would think, well, what harm can I come to as a woman if there is another woman in the car? Little did they know that this, as she was at the time, quite a waif-like, dark-haired and doe-eyed creature, was a complete and utter psychopath, a sexual psychopath, because they would take their victims back to their house, they would do terrible things to them, and they would ultimately kill them. Now, ultimately, when they got found out, because the reason they got found out, which is kind of a sort of like more interesting story, was that their oldest daughter between them, so Fred West would have 2 children with his first wife, and then they would have a cluster of children between them, and then Rose would carry on being pregnant, but this was often by her client. For years, Rose West worked as a known prostitute in Gloucester. This was to supplement his meagre wages that he would get as an odd job man and a farmhand, but also because she enjoyed it. And from these encounters, it would turn out that she would have subsequent children. So between them, they had 10 children in this house, where they were also torturing and murdering women and young girls. There was a children's home that was nearby to their house, apparently, and a lot of the girls from this children's home knew that they could go and round to the West's house and they'd get a friendly welcome, they'd get something to eat, and you could play with some of the younger children. It was a nice place to be, but it would come at a price, and the price was that they were expected to turn into sex workers as well, as was the stream of female lodgers that would move through the house. It was expected that they would kind of lodge with the house, but also that they would engage in sexual activity with both Fred and Rose West and also clients. And if they objected to that, then they were easily disposed of. So those were the crimes, the terrible crimes. I've only skirted across them really briefly because I want to get into the bit underneath, the headlines, what was going on in their heads individually, but then together, that turned them into this killing couple that knew no bounds, that just carried on killing for absolutely years, all through the 70s seemingly and most of the 80s. If we look at them individually, so Fred West was born just at the end of World War II. Now, in rural Gloucester at the time, yes, of course, the war was going on and it was known it was going on, but there's bits of the country that were largely unaffected. Rationing, of course, went on, but the actual kind of day-to-day stuff largely went unaffected. Now, he was born into a rural farming family where, from a lot of reports that I've read, incest was just the culture. When apparently he raped and impregnated one of his younger sisters, and the younger sister went to his mother and told her about this abuse, the mum would just say, oh, well, it's kind of what's expected. There were talks about him having an incestuous relationship with his mother, his father with his sisters. And this was the kind of culture. And he kind of also grew up with this he was uneducated and unsocietised. And also with his thoughts of, well, if you want something, you just go and get it. And he would go round to the local dances at the time. And if he saw a girl that he liked the look of, he would just go up and openly fondle her. And if she objected, then, well, she was just to be dismissed and completely forgotten about. And he'd just move on to the next one. What he wanted sexually, and because of his petty crime kind of legally as well, what he wanted, he would just go and get. He had no thoughts for the implications of that. It's the culture. If I want it, I just go and get it. Now, on the other side of that, you have Rosemary West, and she was brought up in a naval family. And again, there's reports and talks about her suffering at the hands of her father, both physically, emotionally, and sexually. They would meet when she was 15. She was just 15. And she was very soon pregnant by Fred West, and her family apparently didn't really take to him very well at all to begin with. Apparently they would form quite close bonds later on, but to begin with they didn't, because he was much older than her. He'd had numerous children. He wasn't exactly the ideal son-in-law. But
soon she was pregnant by him, and very much she was throwing her all in with him and forgetting her family, or for the time being forgetting her family. So you have these two people that have come from really challenging, abusive, disparate backgrounds, and instead of, as often might happen, they would kind of get together and one might be able to kind of reduce the impact of the other. It almost became competitive between them about how deranged they could get. Apparently when the police would enter the house, there were lots of videos about bondage and child abuse and incest and bestiality. Their sexual appetite seemingly knew no bounds. Together with clients, with other people, it knew no bounds. And you get these two people together that just seemingly wanted to encourage each other. Now, Rosemary West, it would seem, was the dominant party right from the beginning between the two of them. And there's talks about how he was quite scared of her. And there were numerous, when they did the investigation and the inquiry into how long this had gone on, they would find loads of hospital visits through the family, through unexplained cuts on their hands, the adults, and the abuse to the children. Nothing ever seemingly happened. And one of the things was that he would come along with injuries as well, that they suspected were largely domestic, that she had inflicted. He was quite scared and quite terrified of her, as was everybody in 25 Cromwell Street. She ruled with an iron rod, and what she wanted, she got. She would be party to killing her oldest child, Heather. You had Charmaine, who Rose West killed when she was an 8-year-old, remember when Fred West was in prison. And then you had another daughter that he'd had with his first wife, Anne-Marie. But their first child together, Heather West, suddenly went missing. It was known, seemingly, by the social services, the teachers, the medical establishment, that they were an odd, peculiar family, and the children were often disruptive or didn't attend school very well, and there was just something very sad about a lot of them, because they were being abused on a regular basis. He was abusing her. And at some point they killed Heather. Whether it was that Rose killed her, or whether it was that Fred killed her, or whether it was that they both killed her together, that's unknown. And it became a family, I'm loath to say the word joke, but it became a family saying to the younger children that if they misbehaved, oh, you'll end up like Heather, 3 down, 2 across, referring to the flagstones that she was buried underneath in the back garden. That's how they would discipline their children. And it was that, ultimately, that would become their downfall, because the young children would kind of repeat this when they were at school. They would repeat it to friends and families, and it just got to be said so many times that the authorities couldn't ignore it anymore. And that's when they launched their investigation and found not only the remains of poor Heather, but also the remains of a lot of their victims. They were kind of in the garden, they were in the cellar. They filled in the cellar because they had too many victims there, so they concreted a large bit of it as well. So that was their kind of MO. What they wanted, they got. And their psychopathy between them, we just go and get. Rose was a complete psychopath, sexually, control-wise, and just dragged Fred along with her. And he was happy to be dragged along with her because he got what he wanted as well, which was to have sex, to watch Rose having sex. There were reports about him raping and abusing his children as well. And the older son apparently was told that at some point he was going to have sex with his mother. And it's just abhorrent to think about it, that this was the culture that he had grown up with and had just transposed onto his children. And also to a point I believe that Rose had grown up with, not to the extent that Fred had. So in the end, you just have the two meetings of these perverse and controlling and powerful minds, and they're powerful and controlling to all around them. Not everybody, of course, not authorities, not the people that perhaps Fred worked for, but largely most of the people in their life, because they were younger, they were weaker, they were more vulnerable than they were, and you just had these two meetings in mind that would just encourage them. If we look a little bit, which is quite interesting, at the parental role models of both Fred and Rose West. So I've spoken about Fred's past, that he was brought up in this rural farming community and incest was said to be the culture of it. And I think it'd be unfair to suggest that that was kind of the thing with all rural farming communities of that area, but it seemed to be very significant in his life. And his role model, his female and male role models, of course, would have been his parents, as they are to us all. And his female role model, his mother, who it is fairly widely reported that he had an incestuous relationship with. And you have this person that then comes along into his life, Rose, who he's putting his role model onto, who's lapping it up. To begin with, wouldn't have known, but would probably have become very aware of him, and was then lapping it up, and, she became his kind of matriarchal figure, especially with the domination and the power and the abuse towards him. It sounded very much like she was fitting the role model that he had of a female, which of course was his mother. His father, seemingly again, was just as abusive towards anybody that he needed to be abusive towards to get his own way, and again, that's, that was Fred as well. Go over to Rosemary and her role models. I've never really read huge amounts about her mother. I've read a lot about her father, but I haven't researched or read anything much about her mother. But her father, certainly, as her principal male role model, was suggestively abusive sexually, emotionally towards her. And again, you have that then playing itself out in her relationship with Fred. She was 15 when she met Fred West, so I think we can take a probably reasonable punt that she didn't have that many long-standing relationships, be they healthy or unhealthy. So he was her first and only proper heterosexual relationship after her father, and he, like the square peg in the square hole, fitted that for her, and she, for his mother, the round peg, if you like, in the round hole, fitted that perfectly. So this is why you have such a egregious meeting of minds and such a, we found each other. If we were with anybody else, they might want to temper us a little bit, they might disapprove of what we're doing. Actually, we found each other and we agree with what each other's doing, and we'll make it competitive even. And there were talks about some of the victims, some of the girls that were the hitchhikers, that they would take back to the cellar of the house that, remember, has got at least half a dozen children in there as well, and they would take these women back and they would bind them and they would torture them and they would just do terrible things for them, because it was a thrill. It was a thrill to be doing it and to picking them up, and the anxiety and the adrenaline of picking up and getting them back there, but also it was a sexual thrill. What they did, there's been reams written about it and many a television programme made about what they actually did, and that's not really for this particular video, but suffice to say, that would have cemented their behaviours, their thoughts, their attitudes. That would have cemented how they felt about each other, but also how they felt about society, how they felt about their victims. It wasn't exactly them against everybody, but they've made this alliance, this perverse, encouraging alliance between them, and that's why and how they carried on for such a long time. It was very interesting when it came to the court cases, when it came to the preliminary hearings. That would have been, after they'd been arrested individually, that would have been the first time that they would have seen each other for some time, and apparently he was quite excited to be seeing her, this woman that had been in his life, dominating him, telling him what to do all of his life, and he was quite happy with that. He was quite happy and quite thrilled about the idea of seeing her, and they were in a dock together, and she turned her back on him because her only defence against all these murder charges that she was going to face was that he made her do it. She was under his control and his power and his coercion, and that's why she did these heinous things, because he made her do it. Ultimately, of course, the jury didn't buy that, but it was interesting that that's what happened. And after that, he would then go on to kill himself, because at that point he was trying to be defensive of her and trying to almost take the blame for her, because there was a point where apparently she got arrested, but because there wasn't enough evidence and he wasn't saying anything, she then was subsequently released. She was then arrested, re-arrested, of course, but he was trying to take the blame for her. But when that happened and she turned her back and wouldn't look at him and didn't want anything to do with him, and that was going to be her defence, that's when he probably took the decision that actually, well, what's the point of living? I can't live without you, this one person that's been so important in my life, but also just what is the point of living? And seemingly he left a suicide note. But interestingly, didn't completely exonerate her. He didn't leave a suicide note saying, I did it all down to me, it was nothing to do with her. There was not quite that in there. So maybe there was a bit of post-mortem revenge on her for turning his back on her. It's an interesting, of course we'll never know because she's incarcerated, not likely to say anything, and he has been dead for many, many years. So that was my take on the psychology of the crimes of Fred and Rosemary West, and I hope you found it interesting, and I would ask you again if you wouldn't mind liking and subscribing to the channel, because it just helps out tremendously, as I'm sure everybody knows about YouTube. And I will be along shortly with another psychology of crime analysis, and until then, thanks ever so much for getting to this point, and bye.